In Matthew 7, Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven." This phrase was spoken in a sermon about foundations, not about fear. Who was he speaking to? He wasn't speaking to distant pagans, people who had never heard of God. He was speaking to religious people, people who fasted, who prayed, who knew the Torah by heart, who cared about purity, tithing, and the Sabbath. He was speaking to the crowd that climbed a mountainside in Galilee to hear a carpenter who taught with authority. And he was speaking mainly to the disciples, men who had already left their fishing nets and were learning to walk with him. This detail changes everything. Because we read this warning today as if it were a threat meant to frighten, but in its original context, it was the loving conclusion of an entire sermon about how to build a life that can withstand storms. To understand the weight of this phrase, we need to go back a few pages. The Sermon on the Mount, which runs from Matthew 5 to the end of chapter 7, is the first major block of Jesus' teachings recorded by Matthew. And Matthew doesn't organize his gospel by chance. He writes primarily for Jews and presents Jesus as the new Moses. Think about it. Moses went up a mountain to receive God's law. Jesus goes up a mountain to explain the heart of that law. The crowd is below, the closest disciples are above, but everyone listens. And there, on that hillside, Jesus does something no one expected. He begins to dismantle, piece by piece, a superficial faith. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not murder.' But I tell you that anyone who hates his brother has already killed him in his heart. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that the lustful look has already broken the covenant within." Do you see the movement? He is peeling away the outer shell of religiosity and showing what has always been underneath. God is not interested in performance. He is interested in inner transformation. That is why Jesus speaks of almsgiving without trumpets, of prayer without a stage, of fasting without a face of suffering. All the time he places two things side by side, what is seen on the outside and what happens on the inside. And he makes it clear which of the two the Father sees. When he gets to chapter 7, Jesus begins to narrow down. If chapters 5 and 6 speak of the character of the kingdom, chapter 7 speaks of the choice that this character demands. He opens by addressing judgment. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. Because we have an enormous tendency to see the speck in someone else's eye and forget the log in our own. Then he talks about asking, seeking, and knocking, about the goodness of a father who doesn't give a stone to someone who asks for bread. And then the sermon enters its most intense part. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. Matthew 7:13. Soon after, he warns about false prophets, men who come dressed as sheep, but inside are hungry wolves. And Jesus gives the criterion for recognizing them. By their fruits you will know them, not by their speech, not by their appearance, by their fruits. Only then, after preparing the ground with all this care, does he utter the harshest phrase of the entire sermon. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father, who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles?" Then I will tell them plainly, "I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers." Matthew 7:21-23. Notice the structure. It's surgical. Jesus places three groups in sequence to expose the same rotten root. First, those who try to enter through the wide gate, which is the path of religious convenience, doing the bare minimum to keep their conscience clear. Second, the false prophets, who seem spiritual, speak beautifully, draw crowds, but the fruit of their lives does not match the message. They have hidden pride, love of money, and manipulation. And third, the most frightening group of all, people who have ministries in the name of Jesus. Prophecy, deliverance, miracles, all in His name, and yet without a relationship with Him. Pay attention to this detail because it debunks many misconceptions. These men and women are not accused of inactivity. On the contrary, they are accused of excessive activity, lacking intimacy. Jesus doesn't say they were lazy or cold. He shows that they were overly active, but active for themselves, using His name as a tool. The problem was never the lack of works. The problem was the source of those works. Before we continue, let me tell you something. This type of study, which opens the original text and shows what's behind the words, is what we do here every week. If this helps you understand the Bible in a deeper way, subscribe to the channel now, because the next study is already on its way, and you won't want to miss it. And it is precisely in the original text that the key to this text lies. When Jesus says, "I never knew you," the Greek word used there is not just any word. Greek had more than one term to speak of knowledge. There was oida, which was intellectual, informational knowledge. Like, "I know who you are by sight, I've heard of you, I know your name." But that wasn't the word Jesus chose. The word that appears there is ginosko, and ginosko is something else. Ginosko is knowledge through experience, through shared experiences, through connection. It's the same word that the Greek version of the Old Testament uses when it says that Adam knew Eve, a knowing that involves intimacy, time together, shared history. It's the word Jesus uses in John 10 when He says, "I know my sheep and my sheep know me." It's the word Paul uses in Philippians when he writes that his deepest desire is to know Christ and the power of His resurrection. So, when Jesus looks at those men with such impressive spiritual resumes and says, "I never knew you," He's not saying, "I don't know your names." He's saying something much deeper and much sadder. We never shared our lives. There was never a meal between us. There was never mutual commitment. You used my name 1,000 times, but you never invited me to guide your motivations when no one was watching. This exposes the stark difference between two things we often confuse: profession of faith and practice of faith. Profession of faith is saying, "Lord, Lord." And here's another detail from the text. This repetition is not mere embellishment. In the Jewish world, repeating a word twice was a form of emphasis, of intense devotion, almost a liturgical cry. It was the equivalent, in our days, of singing loudly in church, posting a verse every morning, writing Christian in your bio, raising your hand during worship. And look, none of that is wrong. Jesus is not condemning those who call Him Lord. He is correcting those who think that calling is enough. Because a declaration alone does not prove a foundation. The practice of faith, however, is doing the Father's will. And here lies a hidden beauty in the Gospel of Matthew. He had already explained what the Father's will is. He explained it throughout the entire sermon. The Father's will is to have a clean heart. It is to reconcile with your brother before bringing the offering to the altar. It is to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. It is to be faithful in secret, where only God sees. It is to forgive debts in the same way that you have been forgiven. It is not to live suffocated by the anxiety of tomorrow, because you trust that the Father sees every need. It is to build your life on obedience to the Word, and not just on admiration for the Word. Admiring Jesus is easy. Multitudes admired Him. Obeying when it costs you, then the conversation changes. And if there's a perfect mirror for this warning, that mirror is the Pharisees. We need to be fair to history here. The Pharisees were not atheists, nor were they people uninterested in God. They were exactly the opposite, the most zealous of the entire nation. They fasted twice a week. They tithed even the mint and cumin that grew in their backyards. They prayed at length. They knew the law in details that would impress any scholar today. If there were a ranking of spirituality at that time, they would be at the top, receiving a standing ovation. But Jesus calls them whitewashed tombs, tombs painted white, beautiful on the outside, full of bones on the inside. Why? Because their faith had become a system of self-promotion. Prayer was done to be seen on street corners. Alms were given to receive honor. Knowledge served to make them feel superior to others. They spoke in the name of God, performed impressive works, but their hearts were elsewhere. In Mark 7, Jesus quotes the prophet Isaiah to describe them, and the diagnosis is identical to that of Matthew 7. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Lips close, heart far. God's name on their lips, self-will in command. 2,000 years have passed, and this risk continues to knock on the door of any religious person, including mine, including yours. Now, an important point to consider. Jesus didn't say all this to create a paranoid generation that constantly wonders, will I be saved? Will I be rejected on that day? The tone of the Sermon on the Mount isn't one of terror. It's one of invitation. In fact, he doesn't end the sermon with the image of the rejected one. He ends with the image of two houses. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. Matthew 7:24-25. And those who hear, but do not put their word into practice, Jesus compares to the foolish man who built on sand. When the storm came, the house collapsed. And the text makes a point of noting, great was his fall. Notice three things in this parable. First, both houses hear the same sermon. It's not that one had access to the truth and the other didn't. Both heard every word. Second, the two houses are identical on the outside. On a sunny day, no one can tell which one is built on rock and which one is built on sand. The walls look the same, the roof looks the same. Third, the storm comes for both. Jesus doesn't promise that whoever builds on rock will escape the rain. The rain falls on the wise and the foolish, on the religious and the non-religious. The difference doesn't appear in Sunday worship. The difference appears in Tuesday's storm, in the unexpected diagnosis, in the bill that doesn't add up, in the betrayal of someone you trusted. Foundation isn't what you declare. Foundation is what sustains you when everything shakes. So the important question arises, how do we apply all of this today without turning Matthew 7 into a witch hunt to point out who is false and who is true in the church? Because that is the most common temptation. We hear this text and immediately think of someone else, that preacher, that relative, that acquaintance. But Jesus' warning points in the opposite direction. The first step to authentic faith is to take the finger that points outward and bring it inward. Honest self-examination. It doesn't begin by proving others wrong. It begins by asking, where have I myself built on sand? And here are questions that are worth more than any theory. What moves you when no one is watching? Do you obey when obedience costs something? Do you forgive when it would be more pleasant to hold on to resentment? Are you the same person in the privacy of your room and in the public eye of your social media? The faith that Jesus proposes is not measured by emotional intensity. It is measured by consistency of character. The second step is to exchange the use of Jesus' name for the knowledge of Jesus. Many people today know how to use his name as a tool, to open doors, to validate projects, to gain followers, to build spiritual authority. But using the name is one thing. Being known by the owner of the name is something completely different. Ginosko requires time. It requires that prayer that asks for nothing, just stays there, in his presence. It requires reading the word not to prepare a message for others, but to let the text confront one's own life. It requires silence, because intimacy is not born in noise. And do you know what the sign of someone who truly knows Jesus is? The person doesn't need to shout, "Lord, Lord," all the time to prove anything. Their life begins to exude his fragrance without any marketing effort. The third step is learning to look more at the fruits than at the gifts. This applies to evaluating who we listen to, and it applies to evaluating ourselves. Gifts impress, fruits sustain. Prophecy, healing, eloquence. All of this can happen through someone who doesn't yet have a fully formed character, because God, in his mercy, uses whomever he wants to bless those in need. But fruit is another story. Fruit takes time. Fruit requires pruning. Fruit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And no one can fake fruit for very long. In the pressure of family, in traffic, in the way we treat those who can't offer anything in return, in the way we handle money and power, that's when it becomes clear whether the root is deep or just foliage. And the fourth step, perhaps the most liberating of all. Understanding that doing the Father's will is not about carrying a heavy to-do list on your shoulders. It's a relationship of trust that translates into obedience. The order of the factors changes everything here. It's not about doing something to be accepted. It's about doing it because you've already been accepted. The rock is not your willpower. The rock is the word of Jesus practiced out of love. When the motivation changes, obedience ceases to be a burden and becomes a response. You don't forgive to gain heaven. You forgive because you have been forgiven and can no longer bear to live imprisoned by what hurt you. You are not honest so that God will bless you. You are honest because God has already given you a new conscience that can no longer tolerate living with lies. Here I want to ask you a serious question. Looking at your life today, what is more important, declarations or foundations? Write the word rock in the comments if you decided to build in the right place. I read every comment, and yours might be exactly what someone else needed to read today. Because ultimately, the warning in Matthew 7 isn't meant to make you doubt everything. It's meant to call you back to what's essential. The question that day won't be, "How many things have you done in my name?" It will be, "Do we know each other?" And the good news is that the answer is being written now, today, in the small, hidden choices of your daily life. If today you hear the word and choose to practice it in the small, in secret, in what no one applauds, you are laying stone upon rock. And when the rain comes, because it comes for everyone, your house will remain standing. Not because you were perfect, but because you were known and you knew, the one who never lets fall those who have truly stood firm in him. Be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. James 1:22. Back in the beginning, we asked who Jesus was speaking to on that mountain in Galilee. Now you know the answer. He was speaking to religious people. He was speaking to those who pray, to those who sing, to those who know verses by heart. He was speaking to me, and he was speaking to you. The difference between a house that stands and a house that collapses isn't the noise of the declaration. It's the silence of the foundation.